The ready room had been loud a moment earlier. 32 officers packed shoulder to shoulder into rows of cracked leather seats, flight bags dumped under chairs, helmets stacked against the wall, coffee steaming on every flat surface. Outside, through the thick glass, a pair of F divided by a -18s rolled past in slow taxi, canopies glinting under a sun that had already burned the humidity into a shimmer. At the back of the room, half in shadow beside the door, a gray-haired custodian moved his mop in slow, practiced strokes, careful not to splash the boots of the lieutenants crowding the aisle. He was almost part of the furniture by then, just the old guy with the mop. Commander David Harlow stood at the front with a clicker in his hand and a slideshow behind him, working the crowd with dry humor as he always did at these mandatory safety stand-downs. Somewhere between a joke about kids and their toys and the first serious slide about controlled flight into terrain, he glanced toward the back, squinted at the man he'd seen 100 times, and called out, "You ever fly, old-timer? What was your call sign?" The custodian's hand tightened on the mop handle. His eyes flicked once to the wall of cruise patches and black-framed photos of long-retired jets. Then he answered in a voice barely louder than the air-conditioning hum. "Reckoning." Conversations died mid-sentence. A few young pilots frowned, not recognizing the name. Harlow's face, though, drained of color as 20 years of study snapped into focus. He knew that call sign. He knew it from a case study about a mission over Haiphong in 1972 that instructors whispered about like legend. And suddenly he was staring at the impossible, the ghost from that story standing in his ready room, holding a mop. The air station lived on routine and noise. Jets launched and recovered in precise cycles. Trucks rattled past loaded with fuel and ordnance, and speakers barked call signs over radios every 5 or 6 seconds. Inside the training squadron's building, the ready room was the heart of it all, a cramped rectangle with faded squadron pennants, a coffee pot older than half the pilots, and a constant low buzz of competition. Junior officers competed over sorties flown, near-miss stories, and barb bets settled in the air. They called it friendly rivalry, but every one of them watched the board where flight leads were assigned like hawks. It was in that space of swagger and nervous ambition that Henry Hank Lawson went mostly unseen. He arrived at 0500 every weekday, long before the first brief, sweeping last night's popcorn from under chairs, lining up markers beneath the whiteboards, fixing the coffee machine with a screwdriver and a strip of electrical tape. He left after 1900 more evenings than not, rolling his cart past the row of squadron plaques with his shoulders slightly hunched, like a man trying to make himself a little smaller in a hallway full of memories. Most of them knew him only as Mr. Lawson or Chief, though he'd never corrected either title. Someone years earlier had decided he must have been a chief at some point, and the name stuck the way it did in military buildings, repeated 3 or 4 times until it became fact. The junior lieutenants tossed him casual hellos, sometimes jokes, sometimes half-hearted thanks when he cleared a jammed vending machine or unfroze a stuck door. A few of the older master chiefs on base nodded to him with a respect that looked a little too deliberate, as if they were acknowledging a fellow veteran without quite knowing why. To the officers, he was simply part of the scenery, a quiet, stooped man with thick eyebrows, a perpetually unshaven jaw, and hands that stayed busy even when he wasn't actively cleaning something. If they'd noticed anything odd about him, it was that he always paused in front of the Vietnam-era photos longer than the rest of the wall, his eyes tracing the silhouettes of aircraft that most of them had never seen outside of museums. That morning's safety stand-down had started the way they all did, a near-miss incident from another squadron, a brief reminder that steel and fuel did not forgive arrogance. Harlow had flicked through slides showing graphs of mishap rates over 10 years, then video of a training accident that had ended in a smoking hole just 7 miles off a runway that looked uncomfortably like this. The lieutenants had watched with varying degrees of attention, some scribbling notes, others hiding yawns behind coffee cups. When Harlow's eye caught the custodian in the back, half leaning on his mop, he seized the chance to lighten the mood for 20 seconds. "You all think you're the first hot sticks to fly low at night," he said, thumb still resting on the clicker. "Ask Mr. Lawson back there. Chief, you ever fly? Or are you just here to mop up after the mess we make?" A ripple of laughter went through the room, more at the commander's tone than the words. Hank's shoulders stiffened a fraction. He lifted his head just enough that the fluorescent light caught the deep creases around his eyes. "I flew," he said. The words were simple, almost apologetic, as if he regretted the interruption already. That might have been the end of it, 100 forgettable exchanges like it, if Harlow had not followed instinct and asked the next question. "So what was your call sign, then?" he asked, still smiling. "We all had one. Can't fly without a good call sign." The smile faded when he saw the way Hank's hand whitened around the mop handle. The old man's gaze drifted to the wall of framed cruise patches. His eyes stopped on a faded triangle of cloth near the top, blue background, yellow lightning bolt, and the silhouette of an A-6 Intruder arcing downward like a diving hawk. It had been there for 16 years, from a squadron long disestablished. Hank looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, then down at the scuffed linoleum. "Reckoning," he said. Silence fell with a sharpness that made the air conditioning suddenly audible. A lieutenant in the front row, halfway through a joke about people claiming they were in Nam, stopped, his mouth still open. A weapons systems officer at the end of the row frowned, trying to place why that name rattled something from a War College PDF he had skimmed 8 months earlier. Harlow's thumb slipped off the clicker. For an instant, he just stared at Hank as if the old custodian had spoken in a language only he understood. The case study, Carrier Air Wing 14, 1972, night strike near Haiphong, heavy SAM environment, one lost intruder, call sign Reckoning, flashed behind his eyes like it had been briefed yesterday instead of 20 years earlier. The man attached to that call sign had been a question mark in every record he'd ever read. Alive? Kia? Lost in the shuffle? Now he was standing 18 feet away, wearing a maintenance polo shirt with bleached spots along the hem. Harlow forced himself to breathe, to let his expression settle back into something that looked like bemused curiosity instead of shocked recognition. He cleared his throat and pivoted slightly, using the motion of setting down the clicker to buy 3 seconds. "Reckoning," he said, almost lightly. "That's a heavy name." One of the lieutenants, a lanky pilot named Walker with 3 years in uniform and the kind of confidence that made older officers both hopeful and nervous, snorted quietly. "So, every old guy says he was in Vietnam," Walker muttered to the WSO beside him, not quite under his breath. "Half the dudes at the VFW claim they flew F-4s over Hanoi." Hank caught the comment. His jaw tightened, but he did not respond. Instead, he inclined his head toward the commander, a tiny apology in the gesture, and began to angle his cart toward the door. The mop bucket squeaked, the only sound in the room for 5 long seconds. As he turned, the front pocket of his canvas work bag swung open a few inches. A young NFO in the second row, Lieutenant Junior Grade Erin Park, happened to be looking directly at it. She saw what the others missed. A worn patch sewn on the inside of the pocket, edges frayed almost white. The dark shape of an A-6 Intruder leapt from a field of blue, the same lightning bolt she had just seen on the wall. Below the aircraft, barely legible, were 2 lines of text, VA-196 and Reckoning. She swallowed. Her hand, resting on her knee board, stilled. Hank pushed the cart out, the door whispering shut behind him, and the room exhaled at once as low murmurs started up. Walker leaned over to Park with a smack. "Guy probably stocked vending machines in Da Nang," he whispered. "Next is going to tell us he shot down 3 MiGs with a flare gun." Park did not answer. Her eyes slid from the door to Commander Harlow. The commander wasn't smiling anymore. His gaze was locked on the spot where Hank had stood, and his usually relaxed shoulders had squared up in that unconscious way he had before stepping into a tough brief. When he raised the clicker again, his hand was steady, but his mind was nowhere near the graph on slide 7. It was 4,900 miles and 53 years away, over a harbor that had once looked like a Christmas tree made of flak. Hank Lawson had not always been the man with a mop and the ancient A6 patch sewn inside his work bag. In 1968, at the age of 21, he had stood on the deck of the USS Constellation in a flight suit that still smelled like new Nomex and aviation fuel, the Pacific wind hitting his face as he watched an A-6 Intruder roar off the catapult with its engines at full military power. He had been Ensign Henry Lawson then, bombardier or navigator, one half of a two-person crew stuffed into a narrow cockpit that felt, to him, like the only place in the world where the noise in his head quieted down. The Navy had taken a kid from a farm in Kansas and dropped him into carrier aviation in the middle of the Vietnam War, and he had taken to the complexity of it with a focus that impressed his instructors. When targets shifted, when weather moved, when a plan spun sideways at 500 knots, Lawson's brain had locked onto numbers and angles and timings with something almost like hunger. He lived for timelines shaving down to milliseconds, 4 tots, times on target, calculated down to the second. Around the squadron, more experienced aircrewmen had started calling him Reckoning after a week where he had recalculated 4 separate strike plans midi when tankers were delayed by 19 minutes. The name fit in ways he didn't yet understand. He had liked that it sounded dramatic. He had not yet realized it also sounded like judgment. By 1972, Lieutenant Junior Grade Lawson had flown 112 combat sorties over North Vietnam. He had memoized routes in and out of the Red River Valley, could have drawn the shape of the coastline near Haiphong from memory to within 1 mile, and knew, by intuition honed over 3 years, where the enemy's SA-2 batteries liked to hide. The A-6 Intruder, with no flashy swept wings and no night rider paint job, had become his world, a workhorse attack jet built to fly into the kind of weather and darkness that grounded sleeker machines. His pilot, Lieutenant Thomas Garcia, had been 3 years older, with 2 kids back in California and a smile that stayed loose even under the weight of 18,000 pounds of ordnance. Together they felt, in that way only very young men in very dangerous jobs could feel, invincible and expendable at the same time. Operation Linebacker I, announced in May of 1972, had ramped up that sense of contradiction. They were finally hitting meaningful targets, bridges and rail yards and power plants that might actually change something on the ground. But the defenses around those targets had grown teeth. Every night the radio crackled with new losses, new call signs cut off mid-transmission. The mission that would define Lawson's name began just after 2100 on October 17, 1972. The air wing's ready room on the carrier had been thick with cigarette smoke and tension. The target was a rail bridge just 14 miles west of Haiphong, a narrow stretch of steel that had survived 9 previous attempts. The route in took them past known SAM sites along both banks of the Song Cam River. Intelligence briefed expected heavy SA-2 activity, moderate AAA, and the possibility of MiG-21s coming down from Phuc Yen. Lawson had traced the route on his chart, measuring distances twice, then a third time, his pencil leaving faint grooves in the paper. The planned TOT was 2:43 local. Launch was at 1:17. Refuel with a A-6 tanker at 1:45 on the ingress leg, then drop into low level at 2:10 and ride the valleys in at 480 knots. 12 aircraft in the package, 8 A-6 loaded with bombs, 2 F-4 Phantoms for MiG cover, and 2 EA-6BS for jamming. He had received the usual reminders from the strike ops officer, a 34-year-old commander who had already been to Vietnam 2 times. Time on target, no mistakes. The man had said, tapping the chart with a calloused finger. You screw up the timing, you stack the jets, you make a prettier picture for their gunners. Lawson had nodded, his jaw clenched. That phrase lodged itself somewhere deep, a line he would repeat under his breath without realizing it later that night. On the flight deck, under red night lighting and the howl of engines at full military power, Lawson and Garcia had climbed into their Intruder. The aircraft's nose had been stenciled with Reckoning in white letters. The air smelled of hydraulic fluid, jet fuel, and salt spray. Lawson had strapped in, hands moving through the checklist with a calm efficiency that made the plane feel like an extension of his own body. When the catapult launched them into the night, the carrier fell away behind them, a rectangle of light shrinking against 400 miles of black water. The ingress had gone to plan for the first 35 minutes. The refueling track came and went with only minor turbulence, the tanker's lights bobbing slightly in their canopy as Garcia held steady. At 2:12 they dropped into the low-level portion of the route, the radar altimeter ticking down to 800 feet, then 600, the world outside their cockpit turning into a vague suggestion of darker and lighter shadows. Lawson's eyes flicked between the radar screen, his stopwatch, and the chart on his knee board, cross-checking each with a discipline drilled into him over 3 years. His voice on the ICS remained clipped and calm, calling out headings and time marks. Left 3 degrees, time mark, 90 seconds to turn point Alpha. They were 20 miles from the target when the first SAM lit up the sky. Out of the right side of the cockpit, a bright lance of orange shot upward, then another, then 3 more, curving in ugly arcs as the SA-2s chased the jammers at altitude. In the darkness beneath them, traces stitched the air, red beads rising in dense fountains from unseen gun pits. The jammers began their work, electronic noise filling the ether, but the threat warning receivers in the Intruder cockpit still screamed with spikes as radar locks came on and off like camera flashes. Garcia's gloved hands tightened on the stick. "They're awake," he said, his voice just a shade tighter. "Talk to me." "Reckoning." Lawson checked the time. They were 42 seconds early. It was a small error on paper, 42 seconds in a 93-minute flight, but he knew what it meant in that piece of airspace. It meant that the rest of the strike package would be slightly offset, their jamming bubble not where it was supposed to be when the intruders popped up for their attack run. It meant that if they continued as planned, the formation would be threading a needle through the densest part of the SAM envelope without the cover they had counted on. He pictured the 12 aircraft on his chart as tiny symbols, their tracks like lines of light pulsing toward a single point over the river. The math started running in the back of his mind almost without his consent, numbers lining up in a silent column. "Reckoning." "You're quiet," Garcia pressed. A burst of AAA went by close enough that Lawson saw individual traces flash past the nose. He felt his pulse in his teeth. 42 seconds early, Lawson said. "Package is going to hit the envelope wrong. We're too close to SAM 12 and SAM 14 when we pop. Re-attack route." "We don't have fuel for a re-attack loop," Garcia shot back. Another voice crackled over the radio, one of the other A-6. "Reckoning. What's your problem up there?" Lawson's pencil scratched over the map so fast it tore the paper. He saw it in his head, a dogleg 18 degrees north, a short climb, a dive through a different valley 4 miles to the west, then a pop-up attack on a slightly steeper angle. It was ugly, off the plan, and it would add 3 minutes to their run. But it would pull them far enough from the clustered SA-2 batteries to cut the worst of the launch angles. It would also drag the rest of the strike package with them, if they followed his lead. "Come left heading 012, Lawson said, voice suddenly steady. "Climb to 1,200 feet for 20 seconds, then drop back to 500. I'm sending updated TOT to the package. Time on target, no mistakes." Garcia cursed once, sharply, but rolled the jet. The horizon tilted, then steadied. Lawson grabbed the radio. His call signed the anchor in a suddenly crowded frequency. "Reckoning, new route," he said. "Recommend all A-6 come left 012 now. Pop late. New TOT 2 hours 46 minutes and 30 seconds. Repeat, new TOT 2 hours 46 minutes and 30 seconds. Jammers, shift your bubble 4 miles west, 1 minute delay." For 2 heartbeats, no one answered. Then one of the jamming aircraft came back, the electronic warfare officer's tone grim. "Copy. Reckoning. Adjusting profile. All strike elements, execute reckoning option." The new route took them through a patch of air that the planners had dismissed as terrain-constrained. The valley floor rose faster than the map lines had looked on paper. Lawson called out altitude changes with a voice that stayed calm even as sweat trickled down his back. They skimmed 400 feet over dark shapes of hills, the radar painting a jagged green landscape on the scope. Traces reached up, but not in the concentrated sheets he had expected. Instead, they came in scattered bursts, like angry searchlights that couldn't quite find the mark. Over the radio, another crew cursed as a SAM detonated too close, then steadied. The timing shifted, then realigned as Lawson's new plan propagated through the formation. They reached the pop-up point 7 seconds later than his recalculated time, close enough that he adjusted without a word. "Pop," he said. Garcia pulled back, the intruder climbing through 1,500, then 2,500 feet. The world below turned into a patchwork of darker and lighter squares. Ahead, The rail bridge appeared as a thin, straight line over the river. The radar tracked it cleanly. Lawson armed the weapons, hands moving through the switchology from muscle memory. On scope. 3 seconds. 2, 1, pickle. Bombs fell away, invisible in the night. The jet lurched as the weight changed. Garcia rolled them off target, diving back toward the darkness. Behind them, the first bombs hit. The bridge flashed white, then orange, and then a section of it folded into the river like a broken limb. After 9 failed attempts, the rail bridge finally gave way under 24,000 pounds of explosives. Lawson barely had time to register the satisfaction before the threat receiver screamed. A SAM locked on, high and left. He shouted a correction. Garcia snapped the jet into a defensive turn. The missile streaked past, detonating 200 feet away, jostling them with a pressure wave. Lawson saw 2 other jets jink and flare, breaking free of deadly curves of fire. For a moment, it looked like they would all make it out. Then Tom Garcia's other aircraft, call sign Hammer 2, took a hit. They were 3 miles off Lawson's right wing. The crew aboard was Garcia's closest friend, Lieutenant Michael Hayes, and his bombardier, Lieutenant Paul Diganuyan. Lawson watched, helpless, through the canopy as an SA-2's warhead detonated just under their right engine. The explosion turned the night behind them into a rolling sun. The intruder's wings separated in an instant, shearing away in a spray of fuel and flame. The aircraft cartwheeled once, breaking apart into 3 major pieces, and vanished into a blossom of fire below the cloud layer. There were no chutes, no beacons. 2 men gone in less than 4 seconds. The radio erupted with simultaneous calls, then silence as everyone realized that neither Hayes nor Nguyen was coming up on guard. Lawson's throat worked once, but no sound came. He forced his eyes back to the scope, back to the math, because 10 other aircraft still depended on him to thread them out of that valley. He called headings and turns with a voice that did not betray the ice spreading in his chest. When they finally cleared the worst of the SAM envelope and climbed out over safer water, the electronic noise faded. One by one, voices checked in. 11 aircraft. 2 men missing. On the carrier, the debrief lasted 3 hours. The bridge's destruction owned congratulations. Lawson's mid-air re-attack plan was praised by the mission commander as the reason the entire package didn't get slaughtered. The loss of Hayes and Nguyen hung over the room like a storm cloud. In the formal after-action report, the numbers lined up neatly. 12 aircraft launched, 11 recovered, 2 crew members missing, presumed KIA. 1 target destroyed. One suggested recommendation for a Navy Cross for Lawson, citing extraordinary heroism and composure under intense fire and on-the-fly tactical judgment that preserved 10 aircraft and 20 lives. But in the quiet spaces between those lines, none of that felt like victory to Lawson. He stared at the empty chairs where Hayes and Nguyen should have been sitting, his hands flat on the table as if he was bracing against a wave. Other aviators clapped his shoulder, congratulated him, told him he had done the right thing, the only thing. Garcia's face, usually animated, stayed set in a stiff half-smile that never reached his eyes. In the months that followed, Lawson flew 28 more combat sorties. He finished his tour with a chest full of ribbons and an internal ledger that did not balance. The recommended Navy Cross vanished into the bureaucracy somewhere between the squadron and the wing, buried under 300 other pieces of paper. When the war wound down and the carrier returned home in 1973, Lawson separated from the service at 26. On paper, he was a decorated veteran with 140 combat missions. In practice, he was a man who woke up at 3 o'clock at least 20 nights a month with his hands clenched, seeing an intruder breaking apart over a dark river. He tried college for 2 years on the GI Bill, then a job in sales for 3 more, then maintenance at a factory for 4. Each time, the walls of whatever building he worked in seemed to close in by the 5th month. Too quiet, too far removed from the hard edges of the flight deck where things had felt clear, even when they were terrifying. He started drinking more by the time he was 32, telling himself he had earned it, that a few babins a night were nothing compared to what he had seen. Employers grew tired of calling when he failed to show up for shifts. By 37, he found himself in a small apartment with an eviction notice no job, and a bottle empty on the floor. The VA clinics were crowded and underfunded. Each visit meant 4 hours of waiting and 8 minutes with someone too tired to see past the number on his file. The term PTSD existed by then, but it had not yet soaked into everywhere it needed to be. He cycled through therapists, never staying long enough with one to get past the intake questions. By 45, Lawson had lost that apartment too. The years between 45 and 60 blurred into a stretch of 15 winters and summers, stringing together nights in shelters and week-long maintenance gigs at warehouses, moving from town to town with his life reduced to a rucksack, a shaving kit, and a plastic folder with his DD-214 and a handful of yellowing photographs. He kept the A-6 patch in his pocket even when jackets changed and bags wore out, carefully resewing it into each new piece of cloth, as if it were the only proof that he hadn't imagined those years on the carrier. People on the street saw only another old vet muttering numbers under his breath when sirens wailed nearby. They did not hear what he heard in those moments: fuel loads, altitudes, times to target, the echo of time on target, no mistakes looping like a broken record. At 61, a social worker at a shelter in San Diego finally pushed through enough paperwork to get him a spot in a transitional housing program tied to base contracts. A month later, a civilian contractor needed someone reliable to clean and maintain a cluster of buildings at Naval Air Station Northfield, 40 miles up the coast. Lawson said yes because the job came with a cut, a steady paycheck, and, most importantly, a place where the sound of jets landing and taking off would be a constant, familiar soundtrack. He signed his name on the dotted line, wrote Henry Lawson in block letters on his badge, and kept the call sign Reckoning folded up with the patch in the lining of his bag, where it stayed for 17 more years. In the ready room, after that single word dropped into the air and froze it, Commander Harlow let the silence ride just long enough for its weight to sink into the room. Then he cleared his throat and hit the next slide. On the screen behind him, a timeline of controlled flight into terrain incidents appeared. The lieutenants shifted their attention back, though several pairs of eyes still flicked toward the door where Hank had left. Harlow's voice came a little slower now, each sentence measured. He moved through the rest of the scheduled brief, but the words, altitude, discipline, task saturation, risk tolerance, were tinted by the thought that someone who had faced the worst version of those words might be pushing a mop 20 feet away. He wrapped up 38 minutes later, exactly 2 minutes ahead of schedule. "All right," he said. "Take 10 minutes, stretch, hydrate, and then we're going to walk through a Vietnam case study that still has teeth for you today. Dismissed for a short break." The room erupted in scraping chairs and conversations. Pilots gathered in clusters of 3 and 4, talking about recent sorties, arguing over your sports score from the night before. Only a few conversations circled back to the old man's call sign. "You really think he flew intruders?" Walker asked, pouring another cup of coffee so strong it barely sloshed. "Guy has to be pushing 80. That'd put him, what, like 27 and 72? Maybe. But wouldn't someone like that be in a museum or something, not cleaning our coffee stains?" Park shrugged, her eyes distant. "You ever hear of a call sign reckoning in that Haiphong case study?" she asked. "The one from your war college course." She jerked her chin toward Harlow, now at the front computer, flicking through files with a speed that looked less like habit and more like urgency. Walker shook his head. "I barely passed that class," he said. "I slept through half of it. I remember a Blade and a Thunder too." That's it. Park did remember. She had been one of those annoying students who actually read the supplementary materials. The name had stuck because of how oddly final it sounded, Reckoning. In the unclassified write-up, the bombardier's last name had been redacted. The summary had described a mid-mission route change that had likely saved 10 aircraft and 20 crew members at the cost of 1 intruder with 2 souls aboard. The call sign had been the only personal detail left. There had been no mention of what had happened to the man who made that call. When the 10-minute break ended, Harlow called them back to their seats. "All right, eyes front," he said. His voice had that slight extra weight it got when he was about to talk about something that mattered to him. "We're going to walk through a Vietnam strike I guarantee you will never forget after today. Some of you have seen parts of this in professional military education. Most of you haven't seen the part I'm going to share now. He clicked, and the projector lit up with a grainy black and white map of North Vietnam. Rivers, ridgelines, and Sam's sights marked in sharp grease pencil annotations appeared. Haiphong Rail Bridge. October 17th, 1972, he said. Carrier Air Wing 14, operating from the Gulf of Tonkin. A-6 F4s A-6 heavy SAM environment, tight timeline. Mission objective, destroy this bridge right here. He tapped the screen where a thin line crossed a river. This case study is famous for one reason. The bombardier navigator in one of the intruders realized, 42 seconds from the point of no return, that the entire formation was about to drive straight through the thickest part of the SAM envelope without proper jamming coverage. He walked them through the original plan. Ingress route, fuel states, altitude changes. He sketched the planned jamming bubble with a red laser pointer, then showed how the actual drift in timing would have left them exposed. That BN, he did not say the name, came up with a re-attack route off the top of his head, under fire, that pulled the package over a different valley, shifted the TOT by roughly 3 minutes, and forced the jammers to adjust in real time. It worked. The bridge went down. 10 aircraft and 20 crew made it out because of that call. One intruder and its 2 souls did not. He paused, letting the weight of that settle. Then he turned away from the projector and picked up the whiteboard marker. We're going to reconstruct the route from memory, he said, from someone who was there. He nodded toward the door. Mr. Lawson, would you mind stepping back in for a minute? The conversations died again. Heads turned as the door opened slowly. Hank stepped back into the room with the mop still in his hand, as if he had not expected to be gone long enough to set it down. The noise from the hallway, distant footsteps, a phone ringing, cut off when the door closed. He looked smaller against the bank of squadron patches, his maintenance polo hanging loose on his shoulders. His eyes, though, were alert. I'm not sure I remember everything, he said. His voice held no performative modesty. It sounded like a man stating a fact that happened to be false. Please, sir, Harlow said. The sir caught a few ears. He gestured to the whiteboard. Humor us. Help us make sure we've got the details right. Hank hesitated, then leaned the mop in a corner. He walked slowly to the front, each step deliberate, as if he were crossing a deck that might shift under his feet. When he took the marker, his hand did not shake. He stood there for 4 seconds, looking at the blank board. Then his shoulders straightened a fraction, the way pilots did when they settled into a seat. He began to draw. He sketched the coastline first, then the arcs of the SAM's sights, then the planned route in a steady line. As he drew, he spoke, not to them so much as to the air in front of him. Launch at 1:17, he said. Tanker track here, 45 miles off the coast. Drop to 800 feet at 2:12. Plan TOT 243. SAM 12 here, SAM 14 there. Jammers up at 18,000. His voice did not waver on the times. Park, watching from the second row, checked them against the slide. They matched to the minute. Now show us what changed, Harlow said, careful not to guide him too much. Hank nodded once, like a man resuming a task he had set aside 1 minute earlier instead of 53 years. He drew a doublet to the north, a small loop, then a shift westward. We were 42 seconds hot at this point, he said. Package would have taken us right through both SAM baskets while the jammers were between orbits. So we came left to 012 for 20 seconds, climbed to 1,200, dropped back, then took this valley instead. He tapped the alternate route, then circled a point. Popped hey. New TOT ended up 2 hours 46 minutes and 30 seconds. Somewhere around there, he added, but the number came out too crisp to be a guess. A murmur rippled through the room. The times and headings matched the case study almost exactly, down to the 30-second mark that instructors had highlighted in their notes. Harlow flipped open a worn binder on the lectern, his personal copy of the mission analysis, margins filled with annotations from his war college days. He did not need to check, but he did anyway, more for form than for his own certainty. The numbers lined up. So did the sequence of calls Hank casually recited. Which aircraft had complained first, which jamming pod had glitched, which mid-calls had turned out to be ghosts. Call signs. Harlow asked. His voice had dropped half an octave. Hank listed them without apparent strain. Hammer 1, Hammer 2, Viper 1 and 2 on escort. Goes for the jammers. Tower on the carrier was long deck. Our jet was reckoning. He smiled, but it was small, almost private. I argued for Abacus, but the boys said it didn't sound scary enough. Laughter rolled through the room, quick and genuine, easing some of the tension. Park watched Harlow, though, and saw no amusement in his eyes. The commander's jaw had set in that stubborn line it took when he was furious on someone else's behalf. You're telling me you remember headings and times from a mission in 72 that we teach out of this binder, Harlow said slowly, and you've been cleaning our coffee cups for how long, Mr. Lawson? Hank's eyes dropped. 17 years, sir, he said. Started in '08. The room went very still. The lieutenants looked from Hank to their commander, to the mission map, then back again. The unspoken accusation that had hovered around the edges, that this might be stolen valor, an old story inflated by time, evaporated under the weight of numbers that could not be faked and details no casual liar would know. What remained was something else, an uncomfortable awareness that they had been walking past a piece of living history for 6,205 days without once asking who he had been before he picked up a mop. Time on target, no mistakes, Hank added quietly, almost to himself. The phrase slipped out, a fragment of an old mantra. Park saw the way Harlow's head snapped up at that, like someone hearing a key phrase in a foreign language he hadn't expected. There it was, the line scribbled in the margins of the old case study, attributed only to BN, call sign reckoning. It had made its way into footnotes and lecture slides as a cautionary note about timing. Hearing it in the ready room, spoken by the man himself in a voice worn down by 7 decades, made it something else entirely. If this story moved you, subscribe to hear more stories like this. Now let's continue. When the stand-down finally ended, Harlow dismissed the officers with a wave that looked more absent-minded than usual. Conversations flared up immediately. Some pilots crowded around the whiteboard, taking pictures with their phones of the hand-drawn route. Others hung back, talking in low voices about how many sorties the old man must have flown, how strange it was that no one had known. A cluster of senior chiefs near the door shared a look that mixed vindication and concern. Knew there was something about him, one muttered, shaking his head. Hank slipped out as soon as the last question was answered. He picked up his mop, thanked Harlow for letting an old man ramble, and wheeled his cart down the hall as if nothing unusual had happened. Only Park stepped into the corridor quickly enough to see that, once he was alone, his shoulders sagged again, the brief straightening of the whiteboard already gone. She watched him for 10 seconds, then turned back into the room, her mind racing. Harlow walked back to his office without engaging in the usual post-brief chatter. The walls of the corridor were lined with framed photos, black and white images of World War II Hellcats, faded color shots of Vietnam-era Phantoms and Intruders, and glossy prints of F-14 Tomcats in dramatic afterburner climbs. Somewhere in the middle hung a photo he had always paused by, an A-6 Intruder in low light, bomb bay doors open over a dark river, captioned simply V-196, 1972. Today he barely registered it. His head pounded with the realization that the ghost from that photo had just plotted his route on a whiteboard 2 rooms over. In his office, he closed the door and pulled the blinds half shut. The cluttered desk was covered with the usual detritus of command, training schedules, fitness reports, mishap statistics. He shoved them aside and hauled his personal mission study binder out from a lower drawer. The leather cover, scuffed from 22 years of use, opened to the familiar Haiphong case study. He stared at the call sign on the first page. Reckoning, BN, name classified at time of writing. A handwritten note in the margin, scribbled by his War College instructor in 2003, read, "Ask older intruder guys about this one. Legendary." He had asked, back then. A retired A-6 pilot had shrugged and said, "BN named Lawson or Larson or something. Heard he didn't do well after the war." That rumor had stuck in Harlow's mind, one unresolved thread dangling in a career built on neat checklists. He opened his laptop and logged into the secure personnel database. His fingers flew over the keys, entering Henry Lawson with a birth year range of 1942 to 1948. Dozens of results populated the screen. Sailors, officers, ground crew. He refined it by branch and role. Naval Flight Officer. Attack, 1968 to 1974. The list shrank to 3 names. One of them was Lawson, Henry J., service number ending in 3147, listed as bombardier navigator, A-6, VA 196. Decorations: Air Medal with numeral 12, Navy Commendation Medal with Combat V, Navy Unit Commendation. Vietnam Service Medal, Republic of Vietnam Gallantry Cross Unit Citation. Under Notable Operations was a single line, Classified Strike, Haiphong Region, October 1972. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. The documentation existed, but it was bare, clinical, stripped of the nuance and story he had just heard in Hank's voice. He dug deeper, navigating to the archive database that stored scanned after-action reports from Vietnam. It was clunky, a digitized maze of file names and grainy PDFs. He typed in the date, the 17th of October, 1972, and the unit. 5 reports popped up. He opened the first, then the second, scrolling past pages of typewritten text. On the third, halfway down the second page, he found it. B.N. Lawson recommended for Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. The text cut off mid-sentence, a note indicating that the recommendation had been forwarded to higher headquarters. There was no further mention of it in subsequent files. It had vanished, swallowed by the war's paper ocean. What caught his eye wasn't just the recommendation. In the margin, in a different pen, someone had scribbled a phrase beside the paragraph about Lawson's mid-mission adjustment. The handwriting was quick and slanted, almost impatient. Time on target, no mistakes, it read. The note was unsigned, but Harlow recognized the phrase from training slides and half-remembered lectures. It had become a shorthand in the attack community for the brutal precision demanded of low-level strike missions. Seeing it there, next to Lawson's name, sharpened the realization that the man who had coined it had never been properly recognized. Over the next 40 minutes, he combed through personnel notes, award logs, and a handful of declassified memos. A pattern emerged. The recommendation for the Navy Cross had been downgraded to yet another Air Medal with a V device somewhere between the carrier and the stateside review board. A handwritten comment in one margin, written in a brisk, impersonal script, mentioned Lawson showing signs of difficulty adjusting post-deployment and recommended monitoring and support. There were no follow-up entries. The paper trail went quiet after 1974, only to reappear in the civilian contractor's HR files 34 years later. Lawson, Henry J., hired as maintenance or custodial staff, Naval A Station Northfield, 2008. By late afternoon, word had already begun to seep out through unofficial channels. Pilots texted friends and other squadrons, "We've got reckoning mopping our flaws." An intelligence officer excitedly pulled up veteran boards and found 3 posts from the mid-1990s where old Intruder crewmen argued about whether the famous BN from the Haiphong mission had ever been tracked down. "Last I heard, he disappeared in San Diego around 88, one anonymous user had written. "Damn shame if true. Guy saved our asses." Another had replied, "If he's still alive, I'd buy him every drink in the bar." Lieutenant Park, sitting in a smaller office with 2 computer monitors and a pile of target folders, scrolled through those threads with a tightness in her chest she could not completely explain. She read the lines about reckoning being a myth, a ghost whose legend had outlived the man, and thought about the way Hank had stood at the whiteboard, his body briefly inhabiting that younger posture. She remembered how his eyes had gone distant when he said the call sign, like he had been flung backward through 5 decades in an instant. She imagined 53 years of people asking him to clean up after them without realizing he had once cleaned up the timing on a strike that kept their predecessors alive. The base commanding officer heard before dinner. A Marine colonel from the adjacent unit texted him a link to a group chat where pilots were already sharing grainy photos of Hank's A-6 patch. "Is this legit?" the colonel asked. The CO, Captain Randall Price, had been in uniform for 26 years. He prided himself on knowing the stories of his people, especially his veterans. The idea that a man like Lawson had been invisible under his command for 6,205 days sat wrong in his gut. He walked down to Harlow's office with his cover tucked under his arm. 10 minutes later, the two men sat side by side at Harlow's desk, the Haiphong report open between them. "How certain are you?" Price asked, even though the lines on the paper had already answered him. "So, I would bet my wings on it," Harlow said. "The numbers match. The call signs match. The case study lines up." He remembered the TOT down to 30 seconds after 53 years. "And there's this." He pointed to the margin note. "Time on target, no mistakes." He said it exactly the same way in the ready room. "I wrote this on my own slide deck 22 years ago because my instructor said, this is what that man told his pilot. There is no way it's coincidence." Price studied the screen for several seconds, then exhaled through his nose. "All right," he said. "We'll get confirmation from the archives. But frankly, I don't need it on paper to know we screwed up here. A man like that deserves more than a mop bucket and a discount cafeteria card." He tapped the desk twice, decision made. "I want an informal gathering tomorrow. Nothing with flags and bugles." He'd bolt. "Ready room. Minimal uniforms. Bring in the pilots, senior chiefs, and whoever you trust not to turn this into a circus. There's one more person we should bring in." He nodded toward the Haiphong report. Family of the men who didn't come home. Through channels that moved far faster in 2025 than they had in 1972, they found her. Maria Garcia had been 4 years old when her father's Intruder went down in flames over the Songkham River. For 45 years, she had carried the gap of him like a missing tooth in the center of her life. What she had instead of memories were stories her mother repeated like prayers. How Thomas Garcia had been the loudest man in the room. How he had once flown 6 hours with a broken radio rather than miss a scheduled phone call home. How his last letter had talked about a kid being we call reckoning who does math like a machine and keeps us out of trouble. Her mother had pressed that letter into Maria's hands when she turned 18, telling her to keep it, to build her understanding of her father from the ink if she could not from direct memory. Maria had read it so many times over 31 years that the paper had softened and torn along the folds. When the call came from a Navy family liaison officer, she was 49 years old, working as a VA psychologist in a clinic that saw 37 veterans a week. The officer had been cautious, measured in tone. "We believe we've located Henry Lawson," he had said. "The bombardier your father mentioned is alive and has been working at Naval Air Station Northfield for 17 years. The base CO would like to invite you to an informal gathering. To meet him, if you're willing." The silence on the line had stretched for 8 full seconds before Maria managed to answer. "Yes," she said. "Of course. Tell me when." The next afternoon, the same ready room that smelled of coffee and sweat and whiteboard markers most days carried a different scent. Starch from dress uniforms, the faint tang of nervous anticipation. Harlow had ordered the flight schedule light for 3 hours, pushing non-essential sorties to the evening. The pilots sat in their usual rows, but today there were also a handful of senior chiefs, 2 older retired aviators who had driven 90 miles when they heard the rumor, and the base chaplain. Captain Price stood near the door, hands clasped behind his back. Hank arrived in a borrowed sport coat that did not quite fit across his shoulders. One of the chiefs had insisted he wear it, pressing it into his hands outside the building with a quiet, "Humor us, sir." Hank had resisted the "sir" again, but the coat he accepted with a resigned nod. It hung a little long in the sleeves, cuffs brushing the backs of his thumbs. He stepped into the ready room with the squared shoulders of a man walking into a bar he did not know he was the subject of. His eyes flicked around the room, taking in the unusual mix of faces. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize for walking into the wrong meeting. Then he saw her. Maria Garcia stood near the front row, holding a photograph in both hands. She was 5'6" tall, her black hair threaded with gray, eyes dark and steady. The photo she clutched was 6 by 4 inches, edges curled from being handled over 31 years. On it, 12 men in flight suits stood on the deck of a carrier, squinting into a sun that turned the ocean behind them into a white smay. 2 of the men in the center were younger versions of Henry Lawson and Thomas Garcia, shoulder to shoulder, grinning like they had not yet seen the inside of the Red River Valley. Hank stopped, his breath catching audibly enough that the first row heard it. His right hand lifted a fraction, then dropped, as if he had started to reach for a handhold that was no longer there. Maria's fingers tightened on the photo. For 3 seconds, nobody else in the room existed. "Mr. Lawson," Captain Price said gently, "this is Dr. Maria Garcia. Her father flew in your squadron." Hank's eyes locked on the name. "Garcia," he repeated, his voice a rasp. "Tom's little girl." Maria gave a short, choked laugh at the phrase she had not heard since she was 5. "Not so little anymore," she said. "But yes, I'm Tom Garcia's daughter." She stepped closer, the photograph trembling slightly as she held it out. "He wrote about you. All the time. He said if I ever met you, I was supposed to say thank you. That I owed you, well, everything." She swallowed. Her eyes glistened but did not spill yet. "It took 45 years, but I'm here." The ready room's usual background noise, chair creaks, whispered asides, had disappeared. Even the air conditioning seemed to hush. The pilots watched, hands loosely folded or gripping their kneeboards, as if afraid to shift and break something delicate. Harlow, standing near the front, felt his own throat tighten. He had sat through reams of historical lectures about service and sacrifice, but none of them had landed like watching that photograph pass from Maria's hand to Hank's. Hank took it with a care that belied the callus on his fingers. He stared at the younger version of himself on the deck, his arm slung around Tom Garcia's shoulders. For 7 seconds, he said nothing. His eyes tracked, inexorably, toward the right edge of the photo, where another man stood slightly behind the front row. Michael Hayes, his smile crooked, one hand raised as if waving at the photographer. Hank's thumb brushed that figure, then stopped. His jaw clenched, the muscles in his cheek jumped. "You look like him around the eyes," he said finally, looking up at Maria. His voice was hoarse. He had this way of squinting when he was pretending not to be scared. Didn't fool anybody, but he tried. Maria's laughter broke into a sound halfway between a sob and a chuckle. Mom said the same thing. She said he thought his brave face actually fooled people. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside, nestled against worn fabric, lay a tarnished Squadron Challenge coin, the embossed A-6 Intruder barely visible. "He left this for you," she said. "He wrote it in the letter. Give this to Reckoning if you ever meet him." I figured I never would. I've been carrying it around for 31 years. I think my purse has had a permanent coin-shaped bulge since I was 18. She dropped the coin into his palm. Its weight was trivial, maybe an ounce, but his hand closed around it like it was 1,000 pounds. Park, watching from the second row, saw his knuckles go white and felt her own chest tighten in response. A murmur ran through the back row of pilots, then faded. No one wanted to break the moment. Captain Price cleared his throat. "Dr. Garcia also brought something else," he said, his voice softer than his usual command tone. He gestured, and Maria unfolded a sheet of paper so worn it looked like it might disintegrate if handled too roughly. She ran a fingertip over the lines, then began to read. "This is from a letter my father wrote on October 12, 1972, she said. 5 days before he didn't come home. We've got a kid in our squadron, a bombardier we call Reckoning. Does math faster than a computer. He sits there with his pencil and charts and makes these calls that keep us alive when the sky is full of junk. If I make it back, it'll probably be because of him. If I don't, and you ever meet him, tell him I said thank you for every time he dragged us away from something stupid." Her voice wavered only on the last word. She lowered the page, blinking fast, and then held out another document. A neatly photocopied award recommendation with a blacked-out section where the approval signature should have been. "And this," she said, "is the original recommendation for your Navy Cross. I got it through a records request when I was 28. I didn't understand half of it then. I understand more now. It's been sitting in a folder in my closet for 21 years. It felt wrong that I had it and you didn't." Hank took the sheet with hands that now shook visibly. The room around him waited. Eyes followed his gaze as he read the typewritten words describing his extraordinary heroism, his calm and precise navigation under intense enemy fire, his rapid recalculation of attack route that preserved the lives of 20 fellow aviators. At the bottom, in faint ink, someone had written the phrase again in the margin. Time on target, no mistakes. The pen strokes were quick, almost impatient, like a man scribbling a summary after a long day. His lips moved silently, tracing the words. Then his shoulders trembled once, and for an instant it looked as though a gust of wind had passed through him. His right hand rose halfway to his face, stopped, then dropped to his side. It was the tiniest of gestures, but everyone in the room felt the weight in it. It was the motion of a man who had spent 53 years swallowing his tears before they could fall. No one spoke. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint buzz of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of a jet taking off somewhere on the base. A lieutenant in the back row shifted, then froze when he realized even that small sound felt like an intrusion. Harlow realized he was holding his breath and forced himself to inhale, his chest tight. Maria stepped closer, lowering her voice even though everyone could still hear. "He didn't get to say it himself," she said. "But my father owed you at least 17 more years with his kids. You gave those to us. I got to graduate from college, get my doctorate, do this work, because you were in that cockpit that night doing math. My brother got to have 2 children. Mom got 25 extra anniversaries. 25, Mr. Lawson. That's what your 42 seconds early turned into." She smiled through tears that finally spilled, a line of moisture on each cheek. "You may think you lost him, but he thought you saved us." Hank's eyes, which had stayed fixed on the paper, lifted to hers. Park, watching, saw the exact moment something shifted behind them, as if someone had opened a door in a long-closed room. His chest rose and fell once in a shuddering breath. He nodded, tiny, then again, a little more firmly. "He deserved better than he got," Hank said. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. "Hayes and Nguyen too. I dragged that whole package through a bad neighborhood. They took the hit so the rest could get out." His voice had always been quiet around the squadron, but now it carried a depth that made every man and woman present lean in to catch each word. "And the rest did get out," Captain Price said. 20 lives. Plus every life those 20 went on to touch. Families. Children. People they led, taught, mentored. He let his gaze sweep the room. Dr. Garcia, her brother, her nieces. The 73 veterans she told me she sees every month. You changed the math for all of them. The chaplain, a man with 19 years in uniform and more memorial services under his belt than he liked to count, stepped forward. "Sometimes," he said gently, "the ones who make it home carry weight that is heavier than the ones who don't. That doesn't mean their survival was a mistake. It means we haven't done right by them yet." He nodded toward Hank. "Today is part of correcting that." Over the next 20 minutes, one by one, people in the room approached Hank, not with the overfamiliar backslaps reserved for recent prowess in the air, but with a quieter, more deliberate respect. A retired A-6 pilot whose hair had gone completely white shook his hand and said, "I flew with guys who talked about you. Never thought I'd get to see you in person." A senior chief who had joined the Navy in 1986 told him, "My first CO used your mission as an example for us when we were learning about risk. You kept my mentors alive before I even enlisted." A young pilot, barely 26, swallowed hard before saying, "Sir, I flew through a valley in training last month and thought it was tight. I can't imagine doing it under SAM fire. We honored to share a ready room with you." Each comment landed like a small, careful stone in a pond that had been still for too long. The ripples were visible in the way Hank's posture gradually changed. His shoulders, habitually hunched, eased back by a fraction of an inch. His chin lifted slightly. The lines around his mouth softened, not erased, but altered by something that looked suspiciously like relief. He said very little in response, mostly "thank you," or "we just did our jobs," or "those jets took care of us more than we took care of them." But the way his eyes met each person's gaze, directly, without flinching, was its own kind of speech. When the informal portion wound down, Captain Price cleared his throat again. "Mr. Lawson," he said, "I can't change what happened in 1973. I can't lose paperwork or rewrite history, but I can do something about the part of your story that happened under my watch." He held up a folder. "We're resubmitting this recommendation through every channel we have. It's 52 years late, But your actions that night deserve recognition at the highest level. I can't promise the Navy crossboard will grant it, but I can promise we'll fight for it." Hank opened his mouth, closed it, then shook his head once in disbelief. "You don't have to," he started. "We do," Harlow cut in, his voice firm. "Sir, with respect, we absolutely do." He paused, then added, softer, "You've been cleaning our ready room for 6,205 days. Let us clean up this part of the record." The line drew a quiet chuckle from a few people, easing the tension without diminishing the gravity of the moment. Hank stayed at the folder for several seconds, then nodded. "All right," he said, "but I'd like to keep working, if that's okay." "More than okay," Price said. "In fact, we have another request. We'd like you to come sit in on our safety stand-downs, talk to our A crew about that night and about what happens after. Not as a janitor, as someone whose experience we respect." He gestured to a chair at the front of the room. "That seat's yours whenever you want it." That same day, as the informal gathering broke up and people drifted out in twos and threes, Hank stayed behind with Maria and Harlow. They sat at a table meant for flight planning, now littered with old photos and freshly printed personnel records. Outside, jets came and went, each one roaring past with a sound that rattled the windows. Inside, the conversation ranged over 53 years of missing details. Maria asked about her father's last week aboard the carrier. Harlow asked about the feeling of flying an A-6 through a flat corridor that modern jets only simulated in high-fidelity simulators. Hank answered as best he could, words occasionally halting when old memories snagged. Twice, he fell silent for 10 seconds at a time, staring at the tabletop. Both times, neither of his companions rushed to fill the pause. They simply waited, honoring the way memory moved at its own pace. 2 weeks later, the changes in Hank's life were visible in small, measurable increments. He no longer slept in the cramped room over the maintenance shed. With the base's help and Maria's relentless advocacy, he had been moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment 3 miles off base, its rent covered for 12 months by a combination of veteran housing assistance and a quiet fund the squadron's officers had contributed to without fanfare. His mornings still started at 0500, but now he woke in a bed with clean sheets that smelled faintly of detergent instead of stale dust, and the first thing he saw was a framed photo on his bedside table. Him, Maria, and Harlow in the ready room, the whiteboard map of Haiphong behind them. The coin Tom Garcia had left for him rested beside it, a solid circle of metal that caught the light when the sun came in at just the right angle. He still pushed his cart down the ready room hallway at 0600, but he no longer slipped past the door without going in. 3 times in those 14 days, Harlow had asked him to sit in on briefings. The first time, he had only listened, leaning against the wall while the younger pilots discussed risk matrices and weather deviations. The second time, he had spoken up unprompted when a debate about low-level routing started to veer into overconfidence. "Terrain doesn't care how good you are," he had said quietly. The room had gone still, and the discussion had sharpened immediately. The third time, he had taken a seat at the front, at Harlow's insistence, and walked them through the Haiphong mission with more detail than he had given on the first day, connecting each decision to the principles they were supposed to be learning. Park watched the way the younger aviators leaned forward, not out of obligation but out of genuine interest. They were hearing a lecture from a textbook come to life. The path to recovery was not a straight line. That first week, he still woke at 3 o'clock on 5 separate nights, his heart pounding, the image of an exploding intruder sharp as ever. The difference was that now he did not face it alone. On the third such night, he sat at his small kitchen table with a mug of tea, his hands shaking, and called the number Maria had insisted he save on his phone. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm despite the late hour. She did not ask him to retell the nightmare. She talked instead about how trauma rewired the brain, about how the circuits that had once kept him alive over North Vietnam had turned inward, firing when there was no SAM belt in sight. She framed his symptoms not as weakness but as evidence that his survival instincts were still too strong, still trying to protect him. The language mattered. After 45 minutes of speaking softly, pausing when he fell silent, she heard his breathing slow. "You did your job that night," she said finally. You did more than your job. Now your only mission is to let yourself be one of the lives you saved. 6 months later, the ready room looked almost the same on the surface. Flight bags still cluttered the floor. Coffee still stained the countertop in new rings every week. And jokes still flew faster than jets on a clear day. But a few things had changed in ways that mattered. On the wall near the whiteboard, between the framed photos of F-14s and the cruise patches from decades of deployments, hung a new plaque. It was simple, a dark wooden rectangle 12 inches wide, with a metal silhouette of an A-6 Intruder in profile and, beneath it, 4 engraved words. Time on target, no mistakes. Below that, in smaller text, it read, in honor of Lieutenant J.G. Henry J. Reckoning Lawson, VA 196, Vietnam, 1972. For the lives he saved and the years they lived. Hank stood at the back of the room, not leaning on a mop this time but resting his hands lightly on the back of an empty chair. He wore the same maintenance polo, but now it was tucked in, and a small pin gleamed on the collar, the insignia of a naval flight officer. Maria sat in the second row, visiting for a quarterly mental health briefing, her notebook open but mostly untouched as she watched. Harlow stood at the front, but today, instead of launching immediately into a safety lecture, he gestured toward Hank. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, you already know Mr. Lawson as the guy who complains when you spill coffee. You may know him as the man whose route change kept a dozen aircraft alive over Haiphong. Today, you're going to hear about something else, what it costs, and what it's worth to carry that kind of story for 53 years. He stepped aside. Hank looked at the sea of faces, 27 pilots and NFOs, average age 29, most of them with fewer than 700 flight hours. His gaze lingered on their wings, their squadron patches, the pens clipped to their kneeboards. He took a breath that expanded his chest fully, then began. I used to think my call sign was a curse, he said. Reckoning. Made it sound like I was the one bringing judgment. But up there, he nodded toward the photos on the wall. Up there, the only reckoning that mattered was math. Where you are, where the threats are, how much time you've got to fix a mistake. I spent 42 seconds doing math one night. It cost 2 men their lives and gave 20 others decades they wouldn't have had. He paused, letting that land. For 53 years, I only thought about the first part. As he spoke, the room held a collective stillness that was not the commanded silence of a formal briefing but the attentive quiet of people listening to something they felt they needed. He talked about the mission again, but this time he spent more time on what happened after. The empty chairs, the awards that felt heavy instead of proud, the way the world had seemed to lose color when the war ended. He described, in plain terms, how he had drifted, the jobs lost, the bottles emptied, the nights on cold concrete. He did not dwell on suffering for its own sake. Instead, he framed each phase like another kind of mission gone sideways, a life plan flown into weather no one had forecast. He did not once say, I felt guilty or I was broken. Instead, he described the way his hands had trembled when he saw a certain kind of cloud, or how he avoided overpasses because they reminded him of the bridge that had fallen into the river. The pilots, used to analyzing incidents through external indicators, understood his meaning better than any direct confession could have made them. Maria watched their faces soften, the arrogance that sometimes crusted around young talent dissolving under the realization that the men and women who had flown before them had paid in ways that did not end with the end of a tour. When he finished, he rested one hand lightly on the bottom edge of the new plaque. You're all going to make choices in the air and on the ground, he said. Some of them will save lives. Some will cost them. You won't always know which is which until years later. When that happens, I want you to remember something. The reckoning isn't about punishing yourself. It's about honoring what those choices gave to other people. The years they got that they wouldn't have had. Don't let those years go to waste, whether they're yours or someone else's. The room stayed silent for 6 full seconds after he stopped. Then Park, seated in the front row now, started clapping. The sound was sharp in the small space. One by one, the others joined in, not with the raucous whoops they used at promotion celebrations, but with a measured, steady applause that filled the room. Hank's eyes flicked to Maria. She smiled, tears bright again but not falling this time. He nodded once, then stepped back, leaving the plaque to catch the light. Outside, an FOA-18 rolled past on taxi, its pilot glancing toward the ready room's windows without knowing why. Inside, the man whose call sign had once existed only as a footnote in a case study stood among people who now knew his name, his story, and the cost of the numbers he had run in a cockpit over North Vietnam 53 years earlier. He was no longer just a quiet old veteran with a mop. He was, once again, reckoning. Only now, the judgment he carried had finally been shared and, in some measure, eased. Hank Lawson's story did not end there. It would continue in the small, unremarkable ways a life continues. In the weekly coffee he shared with Maria after her visits, in the way young pilots stopped to ask him questions about routes and weather and fear, in the letters Captain Price sent every 3 months checking on the status of the resubmitted award. Whether a Navy Cross eventually hung on his wall or not, something more important had already been restored. His sense that the math he had done in that cockpit, seconds and degrees and distances measured under fire, had added up to more than 2 names on a wall. It had added up to birthdays, graduations, promotions, marriages, and 25 anniversaries that never would have happened otherwise. Hank's story showed that heroes did not always stand beneath flags or on parade grounds to be recognized. Sometimes they pushed mop buckets down forgotten hallways, carrying histories no one had asked to hear. Sometimes the bravest thing they did was not a mid-air course correction under enemy fire, but the slow, stubborn work of surviving the years after. If his journey from cockpit to corridor to front of the ready room reminded even one person watching that true valor could be quiet, unseen, and still immeasurably powerful, then the story had done its job. If Hank Lawson's journey taught you something about unseen courage and the long tale of service, consider staying with this channel. Subscribe for more stories that honor those who served, those who sacrificed, and those who kept going when the cameras were gone. Click the next video on your screen to meet another veteran whose quiet decisions shaped countless lives. Thank you for watching.